Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of The Collective Conscious. My name is Junwei, and I'm joined by my friend Tyler. Tyler, why don't you give us a little short intro, give some insight to our podcast and sort of the underlying themes behind it.
Sure. So, Junwei, you and I have been friends for 8 or 9 years now, since ninth grade marketing class.
Yep, it's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a great time. So in that time, we have definitely bonded over a mutual interest in discussing philosophy and psychology and sometimes politics. And for a little while now, we have been wanting to create a platform with which we could share these discussions with other people and hopefully learn something from other people getting involved as well. And so, since this is the first episode, I'm going to briefly explain what goes into the show, what the main ideas are, and then we'll get right into the first idea, the first episode. So, our idea for this show is that each time we make an episode, we're going to agree beforehand on one central question or topic that we want to talk about. And then leading up to actual recording, we're both going to separately research that topic, gather our thoughts, compile them together, and then come together before we actually share with each other what we're thinking and have a real discussion about it without any scripting, without any premeditated ideas. It's just us naturally having a conversation. And so, with that said, let's get into the first episode. And the question for this one is, should we strive for happiness?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start. In my take, I think happiness is, broadly speaking, is a state of being and not really a goal to achieve. So, in the philosophy sense, I would say happiness is a means to an end, but not the end itself. Um, and I also want to, sort of my framework for this is I want to make a pretty big differentiation between hedonism and eudaimonia. And for, viewers at home who have not heard of the eudaimonia word, comes from Greek, by Aristotle, and sort of literally means, human flourishing, and fulfillment. And I think that distinction is pretty key, just as an intro to what I'll be talking about. Um, and so going along with that, I would say that in, sort of today's society, we come to believe, uh, or perhaps expect that happiness, once achieved, is a sustained state of being, sort of an end goal. The reality, of course, is that few people sustain happiness for a very long time. So the achievement is short-lived, replaced by, other states of mind. People get anxious, depressed. Um, you can experience doubt, anger, fear, whatever. The state of happiness is really just a blip in the spectrum of natural emotions that humans go through. And in my opinion, that it makes a wrong thing to set as a goal. So that's
I'm
that's
really
kind of,
glad.
yeah.
I'm really glad that you started with a definition of happiness, because that's the exact same way that I started when I was starting to think about this. And it's really funny that you use the word state of being, because one of my first bullet points is happiness is a state of being.
So why don't you elaborate on that?
Sure. So I really think there are, generally speaking, two broad but not identical definitions of happiness. People use them pretty interchangeably, but I wouldn't say they're really the same thing. So the first one would be happiness as an emotion, as an instantaneous and temporary emotion, something akin to joy. And how I would think about this is as happiness as the antithesis to sadness. And the other definition that I think people broadly use the word happiness for is happiness as a state of being, like I mentioned. And I would say that this is more an antithesis to a depression or a depressive state, something more underlying, something that has to do with a holistic view of oneself rather than a very short-term view of what one is feeling at the moment.
Okay, so
So
that's your broad definition, sort of.
I would say that those are the two definitions that people generally use, and it's really two different questions to ask whether you're striving for the first one or the second one.
Okay, so why don't we dive deeper into that? And so, I guess let me ask you, what do you think? Is it possible to, you know, achieve both definitions of both short-term, temporary happiness? Like, I think that seems possible. Like that's reasonable to say that, for 1 hour I was happy. Like I don't think that's too controversial. And then the other definition, which is the long-term sustained state of being happiness, that also seems pretty reasonable as well. If you ask a person, say, are you happy? And then he would reply, I'm happy overall. Yeah, I mean that's so. What do you think about that?
I think that people have the assumption, it seems to me, that happiness is obviously what people should be trying to attain. I think specifically people more talk about the second definition of happiness, the long-term state of being, when they're saying that. I would say that the first definition, where happiness is purely a temporary emotion, is almost an impossible goal. You mentioned that happiness is more of a means to an end, and I definitely agree with that. I think that if you use happiness as your goal, you'll never really be able to achieve it, or at least not in a sustainable way. I don't think it's a useful thing to target in and of itself. I think it should be the byproduct of something more important, which leads really to the question of what is the value of happiness in overall hierarchy of values in one's life. And that's a question that people have probably been trying to answer for thousands of years. So I'm not going to claim to have a true answer by any means, but I don't think happiness should be at the top of that hierarchy because it's not a useful end in and of itself.
I mean, I think I really agree with that. And just to touch on your point on that happiness is temporary and fleeting, just take a daily example. If you're eating lunch or eating dinner at your home at 7:30 p.m., you're eating, I don't know, pasta with chicken. Yeah, pretty bland. But I don't think, I mean, are you really happy? I mean, you could say you're happy, but I would really classify that as more as content. I mean, I would say the times you're happy in that kind of hedonistic way would be, let's say you go to your favorite concert and that those 3 hours, yeah, you're happy there. You go to something like Dave and Buster's, like that's a very energetic, you're moving around, like that's happy. But if something kind of more mundane level, I would classify as more as content, which so following that, as you said, what is the meaning of happiness and what is the value of that? So um, since it is a means to an end and not the end of self, I would really ask people, what do you ultimately care about and want to achieve in life, and what kind of person do you want to be? And I feel like the answers to those questions can really, once you know the answers to those questions, which is easier said than done, but once you do figure that out, that would happiness can come from those questions.
Yeah, I agree. And I think an interesting question would be, given the choice, would you rather be content with your life and not have much volatility in your, let's say, emotional state? Or would you rather have higher highs and lower lows? I think people's answers will definitely vary on that. But the idea of constantly chasing the highest high you can possibly get in that moment, I definitely think is unsustainable. And that leads me briefly to something that I was thinking about when I was thinking about happiness as a temporary emotion. I really think if you want to make that your goal, there are three ways to go about doing that, in my opinion. The first would be always maximizing your happiness at the current moment, no matter how you want to do that. The second would be maximizing your lifetime cumulative happiness. And the last one would be maximizing your lifetime peak levels of happiness. So like having the highest high possible at some point. The first one of those, I really think, is the most unsustainable in that if you're focusing only on the short term, it's pretty self-evident that your ability to maximize your short-term happiness is going to continually decrease as you put no effort into your long-term state of being. But with regards to maximizing your lifetime cumulative happiness or maximizing your peak happiness at any one point in your life, those are a little more interesting. And I'm not convinced fully either way whether or not those would be sustainable goals. Regardless, I don't think they would be optimal goals, but I'm not sure if they would be sustainable or not. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the long-term happiness and trying to, your second goal of increasing your lifetime happiness and your third goal of increasing the peak of your lifetime happiness, um, I think in theory, those can be achieved, but I think on paper it might be very hard to do, which brings me to my next point of hedonic adaptation, which is, very related to uh, lifetime happiness and that sort of thing. So, you know, hedonic adaptation is as you immerse yourself in pleasure, the amount of pleasure you derive from it progressively decreases at some rate. So, there's a famous experiment regarding disabled people and lottery winners, and they looked at their current state of happiness, their baseline level, and then once they got an injury and they were in a wheelchair for the rest of life, or on the contrary, won the lottery and you got money for the rest of your life. In both cases, after I want to say after 6 months or to 2 years, their happiness did rise or decrease depending on what happened. But eventually it went back to the baseline level. So I guess to answer your question in a way that um, it's possible to alter your lifetime happiness, but only temporarily, and eventually, uh, I feel like it falls back to the baseline. So, what do you think about that?
I think that that's probably generally true. And I think possibly the biggest reason for that is that emotions are relative in the sense that there really would be no such thing as happiness were it not for such a thing as sadness. Um, if you're constantly chasing one side, then eventually that side will cease to exist. You need to experience both sides of the spectrum in order to understand that there even exists a spectrum in the first place.
I think
So
that's yeah.
go ahead.
I think that's generally true, just because uh, I guess in a form of logic, how can you really experience something without feeling happy? You can't know what's happy is until you know what sad is. So that sort of thing. That's what I wanted to say.
Hmm. I think that definitely makes sense. Um, so one other thing that I want to get into with happiness is not just a yes or no question of whether or not we should strive for it, but possible alternatives. And, in thinking about this over the last week or so, I had a really hard time coming up with a viable alternative that didn't, in the end, just resort to me using a line of logic that it would make me happier. I really found that the idea that happiness is of the highest value was kind of a black hole in that things just kept coming back to that one concept. It was hard for me to really negate it. Um, but I do think one thing that's important in trying to determine what the highest value is for striving for something in your life is the willingness to fight and the willingness to suffer. Um, and what I mean by that is if you're always trying to be happy, then you are never willing to battle for something. You're never willing to sacrifice or overcome anything. And it seems to me that that's an extremely shallow life as a whole. I think the willingness to be miserable is incredibly important. And happiness doesn't really, if happiness is your highest goal, then it doesn't really allow for the willingness to be miserable as much. I think that's a pretty important point in trying to determine something to strive for.
So when you say you're willing to be miserable, is that just in your natural sort of life, and everyone inevitably gets setbacks in life, and is that what you're trying to say is, instead of saying like, wow, I can't believe this happened to me, I'm so unlucky, you rather shift your attitude to, okay, that happened to me, let me see what I can do about it? Is that what you're trying to say?
I think it's not quite that. It's more about voluntary suffering in order to achieve something greater. So, for example, um, someone working on a scientific breakthrough might put in hours and hours of suffering and misery in order to work for something greater. And can you say that they're happy necessarily in those moments? Well, it might depend on the person, but generally speaking, I would say probably not. But the willingness to suffer in that moment provides greater value at a future time, which is not necessarily related to happiness on its own. It's something that transcends happiness in a sense. It's a greater sense of meaning, I would say, to be willing to battle and to win in order to achieve something or accomplish something, create or invent, discover.
I see what you're saying. So would you say that, those people who do that would be, on the whole, more happy than, let's say, people who kind of like their life was handed to them? You were, let's say, born rich, your parents got you a really good job, and you pretty much had to work for nothing in your life. So what do you say, you try to contrast those two examples? What do you say the latter of, being everything is handed to you? What do you say those people on the whole have lower happiness, or do you think they can still be happy?
Well, I would question whether someone who never had to work for anything is truly happy in the first place, um, except outside of very shallow and short-term things like distracting yourself with entertainment, for example, or drugs or anything of that sort. Um, so on the whole, yeah, I would say the person who's willing to suffer is happier, but I don't think happiness itself is what's the most important thing there. I think the most important thing is substance. And that's really where the person who's willing to suffer has an advantage, is in the substance of their life, the things that enrich one's life
So
rather than just make it bearable.
it seems like to me what you're saying is sort of talking about the human condition as a whole, that humans are kind of should be born with, um, not necessarily born with a purpose, but at some point in their life, they should find a purpose, or some kind of meaning in your life. And with purpose and meaning, that comes with being miserable, as you talked about, having setbacks and having to push through them. Um, so that gets into more like really philosophical. What does it really mean to be alive, and what does life really have a meaning, I guess?
I would say this: if life does have a meaning, I highly doubt that happiness is the meaning. I know that contradicts what a lot of ancient philosophers had thought, but it doesn't seem to me that happiness on its own brings enough substance to really say that it could be the meaning of life. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good point. I wanted to something related to that, because I'm glad you brought that up, is a thought experiment on happiness and pleasure, and sort of this the short-term gratification that people seek that quote unquote makes them happy. And this thought experiment attempts to refute that notion. So This is by a philosopher named Robert Nozick, attempted to refute hedonism, and it does so by imagining a choice between everyday reality and an apparently simulated reality. Um, and so, if you say that the primary thesis of hedonism is that pleasure is the good, then any component of life that is not pleasurable does nothing directly to increase one's well-being. So can you get aboard with that kind of initial thesis?
Yeah, I was reading about that thought experiment as well. I actually wrote in my notes, and this is something that I thought about before I read about the thought experiment, and it kind of just tied it together, is that I think chasing happiness is sort of akin to Cypher's decision in The Matrix. You've seen The Matrix, right?
I have not.
You haven't seen The Matrix, dude?
On my bucket list.
All right, you just embarrassed yourself in front of all 5 people. Anyways, I'll give you a very brief description of that then. Cypher is a character in the original movie of The Matrix who is awoken from the system, from the simulation, and he decides after living in the, quote, real world for long enough that he wants to forget that the real world existed because it is too miserable and go back into the Matrix and forget everything that he learned since being awoken. And in order to do this, he sacrifices his comrades, we'll say, in the real world. When he's awoken in the Matrix, according to the deal that he makes, he won't remember doing that. And so he won't have the burden. However, he'll be happy. He'll be in the Matrix. He won't know that he's in a simulation. And he makes that decision almost joyfully. There's a scene of him in the Matrix eating a steak, like a really expensive steak. He knows it's fake. He says, I know this is fake, but it doesn't really affect his enjoyment of it. And I see striving for happiness is really similar to the decision that Cypher is making, where you kind of have to blind yourself from a lot of stuff to just be happy all the time. And then the other similarity I would see between his decision in the movie and potentially someone's decision in real life is that he had to sacrifice the people around him in order to live in that bliss and in that ignorance. I think that's pretty similar to what you would have to do in real life. You have to sacrifice the people around you in a lot of ways if you just want to maximize your own happiness. And that doesn't even come down just to like actually doing negative things to other people potentially, but not fulfilling any sort of responsibilities that you may have to other people is certainly hurting them in a similar way that Cypher did. I know you don't have as much context because you haven't seen the movie, but I try to explain that in the simplest way possible. So it reminded me of Nozick's thought experiment when I was reading about that.
I can see the similarities between them. And so going back on that thought experiment, if there's any, I mean, it's not the perfect thought experiment. Definitely, there are a couple holes in it, but I would say, the main premise of, just being that machine, in this machine that you can just get pleasure from, and most people would say to not be in that machine. So I do want to kind of play devil's advocate on this thought experiment and say that, what if like 50% of the population is already in this machine? And so I think this thought experiment suffers from, status quo bias, like a sort of a preference for the current state of affairs. And so if some people are already in the machine, then that might actually sway your decision, but I guess that's besides the point.
That's actually a really good point, though. I wonder how different people's answers would be if they were told that they were one of the few people who didn't want to be in the machine. I
I'm
think
not exactly sure on the answer to that. So
I would be curious to know. I have no idea how much it would actually impact people's answers, but I'd be curious to know what the results were. But to the actual thought experiment itself, I really struggle to come up with a reason not to just enter the simulation. And I know that goes contrary to what I was like, just explaining about Cypher. I think when you think about it logically, it's hard to come up with a really valid reason to not just indulge and accept the simulation without the concept of morality. I think what it comes down to is um, maybe not a moral obligation, but some sort of moral virtue that would prevent you from doing that, some sort of desire for greater purpose, greater virtue. But I don't think you can make the argument without the existence of morality.
right. I mean, I can see that purely on logic alone. There's great reason to enter the machine, but I guess humans aren't always motivated by logic. So I would say, a person's answer to this experiment would probably lean a lot more towards their emotional gut than writing out a logic problem.
Yeah. Well, I agree with that certainly. And I think that demonstrates that what people are really searching for isn't actually happiness, even if they think it is. Because if you say you're just searching for happiness and you wouldn't go into the machine, then is what you're searching for really happiness, or are you just convinced that that's the case?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I guess if you don't go into the machine, you're kind of saying that that's not the end all be all of life. Is just to have constant bliss and happiness. It's something else. Like there's something about being a human that wants you to do more things. To sort of getting back to that original notion of having a purpose.
Yeah, I think we have most likely an evolutionary drive to do something, quote, greater. Um, but that gets into a whole debate about nihilism or existentialism. So that actually brings up kind of an interesting point, though, in that if you're a nihilist, is there any reason not to enter the machine or the simulation? Or even in more real terms, if you're a nihilist, is there any reason not to just pursue short-term pleasure?
I'm not super informed on this branch of philosophy, nihilism. So I would say that on the surface, I can't think of any really strong contenders for to not enter it if that's what you believe in. I don't know. Can you think of any pushbacks on that?
I'm not convinced a nihilist would really ever have a reason not to enter the machine. Um, I'd love to hear an opinion from the framework of nihilism for not entering it, but I think that argument would have to come down to some sort of meaning in human nature and contradict the premises of nihilism itself. I'd be pretty interested to hear someone try to do it, though. I mean, just because I can't think of a valid argument from that standpoint doesn't mean that there doesn't exist one. But I really do think that the thought experiment itself, the most important takeaway is what it reveals about human nature, is that we really are looking for something greater, whether or not we know it.
Yeah, I mean, I think looking for something greater, and this is also in another thing I wanted to talk about was Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is I think very closely related to sort of this concept of general purpose. Because so for people who don't know that, it's just a psychologist named Maslow developed a theory that people will follow a hierarchy of needs, and that until one satisfied more basic needs, they won't concern themselves with higher needs. So, someone dying of hunger typically doesn't worry about self-esteem. But the main thing I wanted to say was, if a person's primary goal in life uh, is to self-actualize and realize their full potential, I mean, that goes just right along with everything we've been saying about uh, happiness isn't just about pleasure, it's about something more than that. So I think even though Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's a bit outdated, I would say, in the literature nowadays, but I think it still provides a good basis on what we're talking about.
I think it's a valid reference point still. Something a lot of people are familiar with at the very least. And that gets at the one thing that I thought of that really could be valued higher than happiness and what we strive for is realizing our potential. I think that in order to be willing to undertake suffering for the reward, as I see it, is realizing the potential that we come into the world with, essentially. And I don't mean that in a theological way or a supernatural way by any means. I just mean our innate ability to create something or discover something or change something. Really, it just comes down to changing things to the best of our ability. I think maybe not everyone, but I definitely value that more than I value happiness in itself.
That's for sure. I would probably tend to agree with that. So I think so far we've had a pretty good framework. I think we mostly agree on this topic actually about should we strive for happiness. And so I guess to sort of bring this to a closing, what are some practical takeaways, just for people listening to this, how can we apply this to our own life, and what advice should we give for people? I know you mentioned the 3 goals, but that we kind of said that maybe 1 or 2 of them weren't so it's like realistic or achievable.
Yeah, I think in a practical sense, the takeaway for me would be the willingness to make sacrifice, the willingness to suffer in order for something better in the future. I think that's something that probably makes humans unique as well, and most likely comes down to our ability to conceptualize time itself. And that truly is a gift in a lot of ways, the ability to conceptualize time and understand that we will exist at a different point in reality, although not exactly the same person, and we can impact that person. That's a pretty startling realization that we're all essentially born with. And I think we have to utilize that gift we're given, that awareness, be willing to make a sacrifice, essentially. And I would say along the same line that pursuing happiness as a goal really, in my eyes, is in a lot of ways cowardly. I think pursuing happiness as a final goal, if you are really consciously doing that and don't just think you're pursuing happiness, but you really aren't, which is probably the case for a lot of people, like we touched on earlier, it's pursuing the ability to never have to fight anything, to never have to undergo any hardship. And that doesn't seem to me to be a particularly satisfying or substantive use of our own lives. So that's what I would say. Sacrifice for the future.
Sacrifice. There we have it.
How about you?
Yeah, so my personal takeaway from this is, it kind of stems from my 2 questions that I mentioned earlier in the podcast, which was sort of your purpose in your life. What do you care about, and what do you want to achieve? And and what kind of person do you want to be, right? So, if you have a, it's easier said than done again, but in my experience and in other people's experience, once you have just a little sense of purpose and contrasting that with a state of just no meaning, when life has no meaning, I kind of do resonate in a way when people say, I can't find a reason to live. I mean, for some people, that's really hard to understand for people who've never been in that situation before, but it does say something about meaning and purpose, and that if people do get to that point where they don't have the will to live, um, and then once you find just a little passion, just a little purpose, a little drive, that can really take you places, and it can be literally life changing.
Definitely agreed. I'm not the type of person to think that there is inherent meaning in life or that there is some transcendent reason that humans exist. I do think it's ultimately arbitrary, but at the same time, I think it's foolish to stop at that point without saying that you can fabricate your own reason to live. There doesn't have to be an innate natural reason.
Yeah, there's not really meaning is the meaning of life is really what you put into it, and so I think that probably nicely sums up everything we said.
I think so too. All right. This was a great time. I'm sure we'll improve with episodes going forward. So sorry for anyone who actually listened throughout this entire thing. Not sorry, but we will be trying to get better as we go on. Hopefully we have a lot more interesting topics to talk about. Hopefully we can get some other people involved in conversations and learn something and see other viewpoints, because at the end we still are only two people, and there are probably hundreds of viewpoints on every single topic. So that's what we want to do going forward. Thank you again for listening, everybody.
As Tyler said, this is definitely a trial and process, and there's going to be a lot of things we can improve on. But this is something these topics really interest us, and I'm sure you listeners have. I hope you will find this somewhat helpful, just whether it's just for entertainment or just something to digest. We look forward to giving out more content in the future. So for Junwei and Tyler, this is the Collective Conscious, and we'll see you guys next time.